next question we're going to talk about is really important, I think, and it comes from Harushia. How can you sustain positive improvements in behaviour? And I think what we mean here really is about maintaining that in the classroom over the longer period.
It's a very common question to be asked, how we can maintain good behaviour over a long period of time. It's possible to have a big impact for a short period of time. I mean, we can see this from, any number of poorly planned research initiatives in schools. Often the very fact that children are doing something novel can have a big impact on their behaviour for a short period of time. If you're, for instance, if you're a teacher that goes into a school and teaches an interview lesson, then the children, just through sheer novelty of not knowing who you are, might give you, 50 minutes of perfect behaviour because they're quite unsure as to what's going on. So yes, we have to be very careful about looking at the difference between short-term and long-term impacts. I suppose this is kind of a Pepsi challenge for most teachers. You might like the sweetness, but do you like it for a long, long time? For me, the way you enact true behavioural change, which is long-lasting, is by habituating behaviour. Now, human beings are enormously social animals. We know this. We look to one another for behavioural cues all the time. Now, that's the theory behind the very common practice of taking a poorly behaved pupil and putting them in a well-behaved class and hoping that it kind of somehow rubs off on them. And actually, many times it does. And it's the reason why parents want their children to hang out with very well-behaved peers rather than, falling in with a bad crowd. And there's a very good reason for that, because children will take enormous interest in what their peers are doing. And sometimes a lot more even than what their parents are doing or what they're told to do by the school. Friendship, peer pressure is extraordinarily powerful. So what we try to do in a classroom situation is we try to set up a set of social norms which everybody understands, and that's why we have rules, but not just rules, but also routines. So you can have school rules, but you can also have kind of slightly more unspoken routines. And these are the social norms you want children to aspire to. Now, the way in which you embed them is by making them clear for a start. The second way you embed that is by demonstrating it yourself, and also facing up to pupils that don't do it and congratulating pupils that do it. So you create this kind of sense of this social norm. So you say, well done, Nadine, for bringing all your equipment today. And if someone else doesn't, like Billy doesn't bring his equipment, you'll say, Billy, what's the class rule on bringing your homework? These kind of things matter. And you reinforce this, and you do something about it when people don't do it. If you want people to line up outside your class, I don't care what you do, but let's say you want them to line up outside your class, then you make sure they line up. And you don't just let it dissolve eventually because you don't care or because you can't be bothered. You enforce it all the time. And eventually you habituate children into these practices. And here's the thing. We can't control their minds, which is a good thing I'm going to suggest. We don't have the Jedi mind trick. But what we can require them is to change their behaviour. And once you change their behaviour over a long enough period of time, it becomes a habit. Now, habits have to be maintained by them, but also by us. Because we're asking them to do something which they may not be naturally inclined to do. For example, sitting still and learning maths, I'm going to suggest, is not something that most children want to do at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon. However, we're asking them to do that. So we need to maintain that boundary. We need to patrol that boundary. And we patrol it with lots of nudges, lots of incentives, and sometimes a sanction, sometimes a reward, and lots of conversations and so on. But most importantly, we mention it, we communicate it constantly. We give them feedback all the time. This is required to be done. You never ever achieve perfect behaviour. You never get a chance where you can relax. You always have to manage your boundaries, even with the best behaved of classes. Because if the children see that your foot is off the pedal, they will naturally start to gravitate like water towards the path of least resistance. This is human. We all do this quite a lot. And if you give us enough time, most of us will. So you create habits by expecting certain behaviours over a long period of time, and then you patrol it. I mean, even Aristotle used to talk about this, that how we change people's character is by changing their habits, because once you've changed their habit, the habit becomes internalized, and guess what? That's what character is. That's what character is. Character simply means how you traditionally or temperamentally tend to respond to certain situations. And then retrospectively, we assign a value to that. We say somebody was kind. We say they were lazy. We say they were hardworking because we look at their behaviour. How did they habitually operate? If somebody's good at waking up in the morning, we say, that they are, they are I'm trying to think of a word to describe it. They're good at getting up in the morning. We just missed that. That was a
Hopefully the
terrible.
lark.
But you get so hardworking, conscientious, something like that. So that's how we enforce it, and we can do this with all manners of character traits. So, for example, if you want somebody to be kind, you demonstrate what kindness means in a concrete scenario, in a concrete situation. You are kind yourself. You reprimand somebody when they're not kind. You reward them when they are kind. And you constantly do that for a long, long time until everyone understands what kindness actually means in your classroom culture. And that's how you maintain long-term behavioural change. It is not easy. The fruits of it are enormous. And I often say to teachers, you must invest in this initial cultural change with your class. You must invest in this building up of a relationship, but building up of their characters until they become the people you need them to become. Because when you do that, you reap the rewards for years, although it's still hard work, but you reap the rewards. If you don't do that, you're teaching the same lesson for 6 or 7 years. And not only do you not reap the rewards, but you're fighting the same battles.
That's really interesting, Tom, because as a science teacher, one of the habituations of routine is, working in a science lab. And so therefore you have many routines around entering the classroom, where your bag, where you sit, how your hair is tied up, within the laboratory. And that's something that's quite distinct in the science classroom, I think. Maintaining that over a long period of time. I remember when I was working in Bradford, children many years later, after I'd got them into that routine, and I hadn't taught them for 2 or 3 years, would then come back into the classroom, my space, and use those routines without even thinking. It's like I've infiltrated them, I've habituated those routines into them. So I think that will really resonate with quite a lot of science teachers and the learners on this course. Great. So our next question is also from Harushan. His question seems to be very popular with our learners today. How do you manage the most challenging of students where talking and advising them is not producing significant changes?
This is one of the most common problems that teachers tend to ask me. You've tried to speak to a student, you've tried to reason with them, you've tried to get them to amend the behaviour, but it's still not working. Well, there's a lot of things to be said about that. Number one is, first of all, what is it you're saying to them? If your conversations with pupils, let's say after the lesson, let's say you've tried to talk them around to your way of thinking. If your conversation is pleading, if your conversation is, oh, go on, please behave for me, then that's already going to be very problematic, because a lot of pupils don't respond to that kind of approach. If you make it feel like their behaviour is optional, if you make them think that behaving better is an option, then again, a lot of students will just vote with their egos and decide to behave the way they want to behave anyway. So it's a bit like saying, here's some homework, but you don't have to do it. But, it'd be nice if you did. Then a lot of students are going to go, why should I do that? So if you say to them, oh, go on, please try next time, then kids might go, well, maybe so, maybe no. Now, that's not the way the relationship between an adult and a student should be, or sorry, a teacher and a student should be. There needs to be an authoritative relationship there, and I mean that in a very positive way. I don't mean that in a kind of brutal authoritarian way. I mean that in the sense that you're doing it for their benefit. If you're just going to try and intimidate a pupil into behaving better next time, then a lot of pupils will just laugh scornfully and you say, is that all you've got? I mean, a lot of students get far worse at home. And also, when we face up to a student in that way, when we're terribly, terribly aggressive, we're essentially presenting a ritual that many animals do in many, many different social settings, which is we're puffing up our chest and we're making ourselves look bigger and more threatening to try and intimidate. And what we're essentially trying to do, what animals are essentially trying to do, is to avoid a fight. They're trying to reduce the chance of being attacked themselves. Now, obviously, in a classroom setting, that's a ludicrous context. If you're trying to threaten a pupil physically or intimidate them verbally, all a student needs to do is just puncture your little balloon, and they realise that they're like the Wizard of Oz. There's just a little man behind the screen, and there's nothing you can actually do. And you're not going to strike them, my God, of course not. So that kind of aggression usually doesn't work. So being pleading doesn't work. Being aggressive doesn't work. So what is it you're saying to them? If you're pointing out to them the error of their ways, If you're trying to reason with them, if you're trying to be rational with them, I would argue that's a very good approach to take, but most pupils don't misbehave for rational reasons. They're not misbehaving because they just didn't understand, that their behaviour was poor. Most pupils are misbehaving because they're enjoying the situation. They like the attention. They want to get a rise out of their friends. They want to get a rise out of you. They don't want to do the work. Don't get me wrong, there are many people who are misbehaving for reasons that they don't understand. And sometimes you can reason with people. Sometimes you can say, do you see the impact this is having on me, on your classmates, on your education? And sometimes they might go, okay, fair enough. So I would use a bit of reason. But sometimes people just need to be told, this is totally unacceptable. You can't do this. And you have to present this norm as not being an option. This norm you're presenting is the way things are. I always say that the most effective way we change classroom behaviours is by, achieving some kind of habitual change. We're trying to create a culture within the classroom. And by culture, I mean it in its simplest form. By culture, I mean this is the way we do things around here. And actually, the tone I'm using to you just now is very much the tone I would use to a student if I was having this kind of conversation. I believe what I'm saying. I care about you. I want you to do better. I want us all to do better. But in order for that to happen, you're going to have to behave this way. So it's very assertive, but at the same time, it doesn't need to be brutal. It doesn't need to be authoritarian. So there's three things I tend to suggest when students need their behaviour amended and they're just not responding to a nice chat. And one is, first of all, I mentioned this earlier, investigation. Is there a reason why they're not engaging with the work? Is there some kind of functional illiteracy problem? Is there something awful going on at home that you don't know about, which is making their emotions seep into everything that they do? That's something worth knowing about, and then you can respond appropriately. But again, if you find out that there's nothing particularly difficult going on, so you've done your investigation, then what we suggest is attrition. You just say to people, look, you're going to have to stay behind. I'm going to call your mum in. We're going to have this conversation 100 times. You're going to have to redo that piece of work. Whatever your response is, you make sure that you keep that up. A lot of students will respond very quickly to, for example, one simple detention. They'll suddenly go, oh my goodness, this teacher means business. And a lot of people won't. A lot of people will see, let's see how far we can push this person. And that's why you really have to keep it up. You have to use almost like a war of attrition with some of these pupils. You will wear them down. These pupils are normally not Moriartys of crime. They'll normally give up relatively quickly. They just want to see how far they can push you. And unless there's some other kind of extenuating circumstance or some kind of particular SEN need which needs to be addressed, this attrition is normally the way you get through pupils, because it shows them that you mean business and you're not going to be worn down. You are diamond. You're not going to be worn down. Attrition. And here's the thing. I don't recommend that you just simply keep using detentions or calling parents home all the time. You have to escalate. So investigation, attrition, and then escalation. If it's not working, if your pupil gets 2 or 3 detentions for the same thing, and more importantly, if they get 2 or 3 detentions for the same thing in a short period of time, then obviously the same thing isn't going to, the same kind of sanction response isn't going to work. You need to escalate. You need to take this into another level, and that usually means getting somebody else involved. Now, it could be a parent. That's often very powerful. It could be a head of house, a head of year, a line manager, whatever head of department. It could be someone from the SLT. Whatever you do, you have to get somebody else involved. And most school behaviour policies are escalatory policies, in the sense that if a pupil persistently misbehaves, something has to happen. Now, it might be a nurturing process. There might be, as I say, there might be a learning need that has to be addressed. They might have to be taken out and do 3 weeks of systematic synthetic phonics or something like that, so they can access the written work. I don't know. But whatever it is, there needs to be an escalation. The pupils need to see they can't just get away with it and the same thing will happen to them all the time. Because again, for many pupils, a short detention is nothing. But what they need to see is that the school cares about them, but cares enough also to confront and face up to their misbehaviours, because not only is it damaging them, but it's damaging the education of people around about them. So, investigation, attrition, escalation.